Okay. Good morning. Now, I want to start by saying I recognize I'm not your usual lecturer or professor, but I all the same want to thank you for the opportunity being here. From what I've read, it seems like your course has gotten you up to the end of the 20th century, right? No, sorry, the 2020s. Yeah, you've gotten to the bad part. Well, we'll try and get through the 21st century, broad strokes today. I'm sure once Professor Zhao is back, he'll want to get into the minutiae a little bit, but yeah. One of the first things that marked the resurgence of the relevancy of what was at the time called the United Nations happened in 2028, thereabouts. The World Forest Treaty. Not a very exciting name. Pretty unassuming, right? But the World Forest Treaty was an embarkation point from which meaningful and systemic attempts to counteract anthropocentric climate change would really start. This treaty allocated funds and enacted penalties to help restore historic, traditional, and even pre-colonial forests to the world's continents. Some forests, like, say, the Amazon, the emphasis was less on reforestation, though that was a constituent part of the treaty, but more so on the halting of deforestation. Wildlife protection acts would follow sporadically for the next 10 years or so, and, well, regrowing old growth doesn't happen in a century or two. I'm sure as part of your basic elementary school programs as children, you all went through some of the old parks, probably planted some trees yourselves. By the 2050s, 2052 specifically, the same year the first humans set foot on Mars. Yeah, I'm well aware you probably studied that again in elementary school studies. Global temperature had risen to about 1.7, 1.8 degrees over pre-industrial levels. Sea levels had risen 0.2, 0.3 meters. 2070s had the first major energy shortage since, well, really the 1970s. Caused by, the transition in most industrialized nations from coal to oil, whether it be synthetic oil from coal, ironically enough, or bioengineered crops that could be used to make biofuel. That went well enough. India and China lagged a bit behind because of their massive, continuing, growing populations. Really, some of the quickest economies to switch over to entire renewable or nuclear-based power sources were in the emerging world. North Africa, South Africa, Middle East, matter of fact. The transition off of natural gas, apparently, was the stumbling block. The big stumbling block. Uranium mining, refining operations had been slowly expanded since 2030s. Since second and third generation biofuels started proliferating in the markets around that same time, it was safely assumed that natural gas transition would be smoother. Tensions in North Africa, the Indian subcontinent, really came to define the next 10 years or so. The major powers in North America and Central Asia, Oceania, Europe, took guided measures, but no direct military intervention was made. Since the decline of the United States in the early half of the 21st century and the failure of the People's Republic of China to take on the mantle of a truly global power, it had increasingly fallen more and more so to coalitions of smaller nations. And, well, again, the United Nations to take on the responsibility and mantle for organizing regional and international responses to crises. And by the 2090s, right on the far end of the 21st century, the first, well, not the first nanotech, but the first scalable, useful nanotech really started hitting popular markets worldwide. Yes, first nanostructures had been built late 20th, early 21st centuries, but nothing practical or applicable on a global scale. These first nano-scale structures were used to augment the ongoing reforestation projects with what came to be known in the popular parlance as artificial trees. Now, they lacked the efficiency of actual trees, especially when you consider that they, unlike biological organisms, required maintenance and construction. Still, in regions like the Sahara, Mojave, even Antarctica, that lacked the capacity to house and maintain biological forests, these artificial forests started being put into place. Again, along the same lines of what you would expect from a tree or forest or bloom of phytoplankton. Pulling carbon dioxide out of the air, putting oxygen back into the air. The nice niche that artificial trees fell in is that they could also remove other pollutants, although not with the degree of efficiency, let's say, that an industrial scale project might. Still, emboldened by this and the completion of the first wave of the solar satellite network, the idea of solar satellites goes back to, I'm probably wrong, Japan in the 1980s. This idea that you have solar collectors in space beaming down electricity through, well, initially through microwaves to receiving stations on the planet's surface, which would then act as the power hubs for regions, countries, even continents. The completion of that network in 2098, or at least the first phase of the network in 2098, led to the United Nations ban on fossil fuels to celebrate the new year, the first day of the 22nd century. Now, I'm paraphrasing popular speech at the time by then Chair to the UN from... Oh, this is embarrassing, isn't it? The Congo, I think. Though her name escapes me. Referring to the 21st century as the long rehabilitation and breaking of an addiction for humanity. And as self-congratulatory as the speech was, and many were at the time, this feat that many thought had been impossible, impractical, even, removing humanity's reliance on fossil fuels, the sad truth in retrospect that we can see is that while the metaphorical addiction had been broken, 100 years of healing, continued effort would be necessary just to stabilize the planet. To stabilize and counteract the methane from the Arctic and these self-sustaining processes that continued to nudge global temperatures up. 1/10 of a degree here, 1/10 of a degree there. 2112, of course, is when the first generation of fusion power plants started being produced. The Karakov design came from, yes, the Russian Federation. Experimental fusion projects have been done in universities and had been pursued, really since first days of nuclear fission in the 20th century, but it wasn't until the 21 teens that widespread usage started being implemented. Of course, this implementation process hit some problems. It was slow, exhaustingly slow. You have to understand, these old-style fusion generators, well, they were reasonably efficient. Didn't pollute any, entirely clean, but these were old fission facilities. Really anything with a steam generator on it being retrofitted to put into place this whole new network. And while humanity had, at this point, weaned itself off the fossil fuels, still the renewables, uranium extraction and enrichment, those facilities would take a long time to phase out. 2118, of course, is when SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, finally made first contact. It would take the better part of the next decade to just decode the massive cache of information that had been beamed, apparently quite specifically, to us. Of course, as you're all well aware, the end of that deciphering process was heartbreaking. Now, this species, we still don't have a name for them, apparently had a small empire spanning stars. If we can someday be so lucky. That they had never found another habitable world. And, well, the signal stopped. You might assume, rightly, from a species advanced enough to settle their entire solar system, to reach out across so many light years to us, and us specifically. Yeah. Well, it's still a topic of hot debate in xenoanthropology circles, what exactly befell them. These, precursors, we call them colloquially now. Yeah, they've been a big drive to get out there, poke around. At the same time, still, quiet sense of dread and paranoia has accompanied this renewed spirit of space exploration ever since. In the 2119 saw the first permanent asteroid mining facilities out in the belt. A series amongst the other larger dwarf planets and asteroids being spun up, turned into permanent facilities for moving raw materials to Earth, ice to the belt from further out in the system, nitrogen and other things necessary for, plants and permanent human settlement from Earth. We hadn't quite made it out in any long-lasting capacity to Ganymede or Titan yet. So yeah, all of that had to come from Earth. And then, celebrating the new year of 2120 was the Aldrin base on Mars. There was a lot of disagreement for what to be naming it. Now, plenty of billionaires in the 21st century promised and delivered in the 2050s the first human boots on Mars. Little known figure, I'm sure, in modern day, along the lines of Carnegie in terms of influence. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, planned and promised permanent human settlement by the midpoint of the 21st century. Yeah, I know, it's funny to look back on it. Obviously, they failed to deliver. I mean, there were attempts in the 2080s, but... well, the survivors were memorialized. One of the first things that the settlers at Aldrin Base did was find and bury the bodies. Mummified by half a century of being left out in the dust. It's incredible, truly incredible that capitalism got us as far as it did. Probably even more incredible that we survived it in the end. 2120 also marked sea levels finally reaching a meter higher than they had prior to industrialization. Early 2030s, of course, saw the first true synthetic intelligences, virtual intelligences, and of course were pretty quickly clamped down on. The paranoia of past generations' attitudes towards artificial intelligence and synthetic intelligence is still obviously a point of ethical contention today. And yes, we do not, so far as the law is concerned, have any true form artificial intelligences today. There was no single accident or calamity or incident that led to these laws by the United Nations, just more centuries of paranoia bred by popular media, science fiction, and this real deep-seated natural terror of being replaced, being outcompeted. Speaking personally, it's not a point of pride that 70 years ago we could have had a true companion along our journey out of the darkness of the 21st century. But for better or for worse, we've walked the last few decades alone. Now, the 2149 is the last use of sulfate use to counteract global warming. We know now, as we knew then, that sulfates caused dimming of sunlight, the thickening of the atmosphere, other knock-on effects. Droughts became noticeably worse. And still, there was a very real fear at the time of letting temperatures continue to rise. Our carbon capture efforts have been ongoing since the 2040s, really, in large continental scale, but hadn't yet rounded the point to where the amount of methane, carbon dioxide, and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere wouldn't continue to lead to accelerated global heating. Finally, in 2153, almost a full 40 years after permanent settlement on the moon had began, finally found industrial-scale helium-3. Mass drivers, which had been set up decades before, spun into action, moving this HE3 back to Earth. Off to Mars and the belt as well, to get second-generation fusion generators, which have been waiting on this promised fuel source for decades, up and off the ground. At 2163 is when the first space construction facilities started appealing. By space construction, I mean spacecraft construction in orbit. Now, we all take for granted today the amount of interplanetary transit that we have ongoing, but back then, you gotta remember, all these ships were made on the ground, right? And so that's why they all look really small and modular and even conical. Phallic, often. These ships had to make it out of Earth's atmosphere, and you lose a lot of energy doing that. You have to account for aerodynamics. But once we started, getting these metals, minerals, materials being extracted from the belt, the fuel being extracted on the moon, well then, really, there was no reason to go to Earth anymore. I mean, yeah, for reactionables, for plants, for soil, for nitrogen, we still needed Earth. But we really could start looking forward to having the technologies and now industries necessary to look beyond a few scattered mining outposts in the solar system to ships that could make the long journey between stars. Now, the first ships produced were glorified probes. This is before we knew anything about, well, anything as far as interstellar travel goes. We had a dozen crockpot theories on faster-than-light travel, none of which seemed to have worked out. All along the Kuiper Belt. It's Wildcat research stations, people producing probes strapped with this or that, and although some things made it nearly up to the speed of light, still even going as far as Alpha Centauri, take years, decades. It all seems so small in retrospect. With the announcement, the first faster-than-light enabled exploration ships being crewed, tested, and ready to finally leave the solar system, you know, earlier this year. You have to understand, when I was growing up, this was still science fiction. And I know for most of you it was as well. Oh, you kids got to grow up with, at the very least, tests going on. Knowing that there was life out there. Yeah. I've gotten a little lost in this, haven't I? But yes, the 21st century. Broad strokes, what you need to remember for your quiz, and I'm sure you'll be quizzed. I hate the things myself. I prefer having you write papers, but you know, that's not how your professor rolls. Look at the natural gas crises in the Indian subcontinent and in northern China. The first, fourth, and fifth gen nuclear facilities coming out of Central Asia and their proliferation from there. The mining bans that came to fossil fuels. Now, remember, before the United Nations banned fossil fuels outright, the more dangerous mining practices had been banned by most nation states on their own. We do like to wax poetic about the 21st century, us stumbling out of the dark, but truth be told, if you look at the planet, its temperature hasn't been stabilized for more than, well, since about when you were born. I know 2.7 degrees over pre-industrial levels doesn't sound like much, but yeah, we could have done better, but it's a real accomplishment. We've frozen it here. And who knows? We can go to other stars, we can explore other planets, we can finally start reaching out there. Maybe we'll be able to, you know, this next century, fix the damage we've done here at home. Not just stop it, but actually fix it. There's no bringing back the green sea turtle, black rhinoceros, or the litany of other species that aren't with us anymore. Not, you know, outside of cloning. Sure, zoos are full of things thought extinct or extinct in the wild, but I don't know. Something made in a laboratory and plop back on the taiga or on the steppe, it just, well, it feels like we cheated. Well, our time isn't quite over, but I think I'm gonna let all you out of here a little bit early today. Once again, thank you for having me and for being such good listeners. I know when I was your age, I certainly wasn't. You do me a favor. When you get home today, this isn't a homework assignment, so feel free to blow it off. Take a look at the old maps that we have of 21st century, and go look at all the cities that are now underwater. If you want an easy example, New Orleans. I think about an eighth of New Orleans still above water. It's a walled-off city, much like Venice used to be. Venice, another great example. Still a few buildings above the Mediterranean, but these sunken cities, these Atlantean cities, still show the work that needs to be done. The waters have stopped rising, temperature has stopped rising. There's still centuries of hurt, of trauma, of loss. That we may never be able to completely undo, and that is why classes like these are so important. Alright, I'm done waxing. Get the hell out of here.